Well, hi again, everybody. And we're going to go with chapter 15 of The Fields of Home. Okay, let's see now. The title of that chapter is Grandfather Sends Me Home. Doesn't sound good, does it? We'll see what happens. I'd planned to back the dump cart into the farthest corner of the barn cellar, take the spreader pad off, and have it hidden out of sight before we quit work, but we didn't get it done. Both Millie and I were so tired we were ready to fall asleep. We still had the evening chores to finish. Grandfather's train wouldn't be in until 8:30 in the morning. That would give us a couple of hours of daylight before I left to meet him, and would be all the time we needed. Millie got supper ready while I took care of the horses, and did the milking while I finished the rest of the chores. After we'd washed the dishes, we took our lamps and started to bed. I had only gone halfway up the stairs when I heard Grandfather call, "Hi, hi, hi, children," from the driveway. Uh-oh. I set my lamp down on the stairs, and Millie and I went running out to meet him. He was trudging up the driveway with his valise in one hand and a big bundle in the other. "Glory sakes alive, children," he called out. "It's tarnal good to be home again. Fred Folsom fetched me out and left me off at the roadway. Took an early train. Couldn't stay no longer." He didn't answer when I asked if he'd had a good time, but dropped his bundle and bag, drew a deep breath, and said, "By thunder, don't that smell good? Don't see why folks wants to live way off in them nasty-smelling cities." I had hauled enough dressing. I didn't think I'd ever smell anything else again, but I took a long, deep breath. There was hay and pine and a whiff of wood smoke mixed in with the barn smell. It did smell good, and I said, "I don't know either. I don't like cities." Grandfather put an arm around each of us, squeezed a little, and said, "Millie girl, I fetched you an all-fired pretty present." Then he looked up at me and said, "Seen Mary whilst I was gone. Told her you was doing first rate." Mother had written me 3 letters, but she'd never told me what she'd written to Grandfather. So I asked, "Did she tell you why you came down here?" "Tell me," he snapped. "Why, so's your old grandpa could make a man out of you. Why else? Now you fetch my stuff along, Ralphie. That's where the presents is." Then he dropped his arm from my waist and walked on with Millie. They'd reached the back corner of the house when old Bess came running from the direction of the barn. She must have been out hunting when she heard Grandfather's voice. She was panting and smelled pretty strong of skunk, but he dropped to his knees, held his arms out for her. She came into them with a rush, looked exactly as if she were hugging him. Both her forepaws were on his shoulders, and she nuzzled her head close to his neck. He wasn't saying any words to her, but they were both making the same sort of crooning sounds in their throats. Millie hurried right into the kitchen to push the teapot forward on the stove and poke up the fire, and I followed her with Grandfather's things. I brought my lamp from the stairs, and steam was rising from the teapot before he came in. The moon had gone behind a cloud. It was dark enough outside that I hadn't noticed anything strange about Grandfather. When he stepped into the lamplight, he almost frightened me for a moment. He looked as if he'd been hung out in the hot sun till he'd shrunk 9 sizes. Millie saw him the same second I did. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she just stood there by the stove and stared at him. It took me a couple minutes to realize what had happened. His bushy whiskers had been trimmed close to his cheeks and into a little pointed cone at his chin. His hair was clipped so short that his grand army hat pushed the tops of his ears out. His eyebrows were just rows of sandy stubble. He had on a blue suit that was big enough for a man once and a half his size. The collar stood away from his neck an inch, and only the tips of his fingers showed at the ends of his sleeves. The bottoms of his pants were under the heels of his shoes. The extra cloth in the legs hung in folds like the loose skin on an elephant. White dog hair was plastered all over his chest and shoulders, and his knees looked as though he'd crawled up from the falls on them. Oh, wow, it must have been a sight. I vet, he was saying as he came into the kitchen doorway. But when he saw us staring at him, he stopped and looked up and down the front of himself. "Gory," he said, as he shook the sleeves back from his hands and dabbed at the dog hair. "Old Bess must be a-shedding." Then he peeked up and grinned. "Bought me a new suit of clothes. Got a real good trade on it off to Portland. Didn't want to go down to encampment, not looking prosperous. I couldn't tell him the suit looked good. All I could think of to say was, "You got a haircut too, didn't you?" Grandfather brushed his hands up across his cheeks, let the stubble whistle. "Neat, ain't it?" he asked. "Fred Folsom, he kept after me, and I got it in the station at Philadelphia. Baba was asking $50 and wouldn't make no better trade, so I dealt for a close job." Oh my gosh. $50 for a haircut sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Millie reached for the corn broom on the fireplace mantel. As Grandfather was telling about his haircut, she made a couple of brushes at the dirty knees of his pants, but he stopped her. Leave be, he snapped, and went over to the sofa. "Here, Ralphie, fetch me my parcel. That's where the present is." I was pretty sure Grandfather always bought Millie a present whenever he went away. Her eyes were as bright as new pennies, and she could hardly keep her fingers from helping him as he picked the knots. I think he was teasing her a little. The knots didn't look too tight, but he kept fiddling with them till Millie put her hands out and said, "Let me do it, Thomas." Take care, he snapped, but he followed it with a cackling laugh and slipped the knot apart. Inside the bundle, his old suit was folded with the pants around the coat. The lapels were short and stubby. He must have had it long before I was born. When he turned the wrapping paper back, he rubbed his hand over the cloth. Seemed to be talking more to himself than to Millie and me. "Ain't scarcely wore out at all," he said. "Didn't need a new suit of clothes. But I couldn't go wearing rebel gray to Union encampment." Then he picked up again. Remember, he was a veteran of the Army in the Civil War. Then he peeked up again at Millie, grinned, and threw the coat open to show the double fold of bright red and white calico. The piece was 4 or 5 yards long. Before Grandfather gave it to Millie, he sort of measured it out with his hands and looked it all over. There was a peculiar smell about it, and a black smudge near one end. Grandfather rubbed the smudge on the front of his coat and looked at it again. "'Tain't nothing that won't wash right out," he said. "I got a powerful good trade on it, Millie. There's buttons somewheres. Made him throw 'em in to close the deal." He moved the cloth along to a clean place, held it up against Millie's apron, and nodded his head in a quick little jerk as he said, "By gorry, Millie girl, you're going to look awful pretty when you get that made up into a dress. Let me see what he done with them buttons. Pearl they was." Millie was as tickled with the calico as if it had been pure silk. While Grandfather was rummaging for the buttons, she draped the cloth around her shoulders, rolled the edge back like a collar, and held it in a low V on her chest. She did look pretty. I was watching her peer into the darkened window pane when Grandfather shouted, "There, by thunder, Ralphie! I fetched you a present that'll be awful comforting come winter. Heft 'em in your hand. Them'll be powerful warm inside felt boots come zero weather." When I looked back, he was holding up a pair of white wool socks by the toes. They weren't exactly white. There were big gray blotches on them, and they smelled stronger of smoke than the calico. But they were heavy, and I knew they'd be warm. Grandfather wrinkled up his nose a little. "Stink, don't they?" he said. "But a good airing will fix that. Made a mighty fine trade on them. 22 cents. Couldn't raise the wool for that." I bet. All the time he was holding my socks up with one hand, he was fishing in the bundle with the other. Last he pulled the card of pearl buttons out of the old coat pocket and held them up. Millie was still looking at herself in the window pane. She was using the window pane for a mirror, and moving the calico into different shapes when Grandfather sang out, there they be, Millie girl. Mark how they catch the light. By gorry, you'll be pretty as any queen." In between helping me in the field, Millie had spent the whole day cooking and baking things Grandfather liked to eat. The red astrakhan apples had just begun to ripen. She picked wild strawberries to put in them and made pies that were pink all the way through. She didn't pay any attention to Grandfather's having said he'd eaten, but put cups and plates on the table, brought one of the pies from the back kitchen. While she was doing it, I was trying to get Grandfather to tell me about Gettysburg. "Gettysburg," he said. "Why, 'tain't changed none to speak about. Same hills and valleys, same stone walls." "Ralphie, did you ever ride on them subway cars off to Boston?" "Sure," I told him. "That's the only quick way to get anywhere in Boston." "Gorry," he said, "go like 60, don't they? Mary took I and Fred on 'em. Miles and miles." He sat for 2 or 3 full minutes, looking at a pine knot that stood higher than the rest of the floor. Then, more to himself than to me, he said, "What in thunder you calculate they done with all the dirt?" Millie had cut half a dozen shapes like strawberries in the top crust of the pie, and the pink juice showing through made them look almost real. Before she set it on the table, she tipped the pie down for Grandfather to see. "Gory sakes alive, strawberry pie!" he sang out and jumped for his chair at the table. We sat there till the clock on the fireplace mantel struck 12. Midnight, wow. Grandfather didn't want to go to bed without telling us all about encampment. But as it grew later, it was harder for him to keep awake. Easier for him to get the encampment mixed with the other times he had been at Gettysburg. Right in the middle of telling us about a new museum, his head nodded forward a few minutes. He jerked it up quick and said, "I seen him, Ralphie. Nigh his ear to the barn. Tall, with sparse whiskers, riding a big black mare. Awkward-like. A parson, name of Hale, done most of the talking." Oh, talking about when Lincoln made the speech at Gettysburg in 1863, not long after the battle. Edward Everett Hale, he's talking about, did most of the talking. When we were sure he was sound asleep, his head came halfway up, and he mumbled, "Ralphie, did you ever ride them subway cars off to Boston?" Ha! He was half asleep, isn't he? After Grandfather went to bed, Millie and I had decided to get up at the crack of dawn, take the spreader parts off the dump cart, hide them, and not tell him anything about the bees till he'd seen what a good job we'd done spreading dressing. It didn't work that way. He got up as soon as I came downstairs in the morning. The first place he went was to the beehives. I was slopping the hogs when he yelled, "Want the last thing I told you to watch them bees because they're nigh under swarming?" "No, sir," I said. "The last thing you told me is you expected me to haul 40 or 50 loads of—" "Don't tell me what I said. Where's Millie at? Where's my bee at? Where'd they go off to?" If he hadn't been so mad, he'd have seen Millie climbing down over the yard wall, heard her trying to tell him what we'd done, that we'd done all we could to save the swarm. Instead, he was storming at me, "Scatterbrained, wool-gathering boy! Why don't you give heed to what I tell you? Where's Millie? Where in thunder's my bee at?" He didn't wait to see if I was going to answer him. He didn't even look at Millie as he brushed past her and clambered up over the yard wall. When he reached the top, he shouted, "What in the great thunderation's been going on here whilst I've been gone? Where's that oak log out of the parent tree Father climbed?" I looked at Millie, and she looked scared. There was nothing else to do, so I said I had to use it for the manure spreader. "You what?" he shouted back. I had to use it for the cylinder ornament that, and the foot of the yard wall, was as far as I got. Grandfather's face was as red as fire. The point of his beard stuck out like a quivering spearhead. "You done what?" I didn't like having him yell that way, and I said good and loud, "I had to fix a manure spreader so it'd be easier to—" Easier, he howled. "Worthless, good-for-nothing boy. Can't think of nothing but easier." We'd left the dump cart well outside the barn cellar doors. I think Grandfather spied it just as I hauled it back at him. "If you just wait and see, he shouted. "What do you think I be, blind?" The yard wall was nearly as high as my head, but Grandfather jerked the axe out of the chopping block, jumped off over the edge with it, and headed straight for the dump cart. "Can't you wait till you see how much better job it does than you can do by hand?" I called after him. He didn't say a word till he had bent over half the spikes, knocked one bearing all to pieces, and broken the chain. "I've been farming this place for nigh under 50 years, and I don't need no tannel fool boy telling me what's better and how to do it. Get out of here. Go off home before you stave up the whole tannel place." Whew. That's the end of that chapter. Chapter 16 will be next. Wow. Not a very happy time, the first day Grandfather's back from his trip, huh? Well, everybody, thanks for watching and listening, and see you next time. Bye-bye.